Hi, I'm Danny Duchamp, and I'm going to talk about free will. I don't know if you've ever encountered the free will debate before, but if you have, you will know that it's a mess, isn't it? If you have managed to avoid it, then, well, first of all, lucky you, but I'm about to ruin your streak, I'm afraid. If you've never heard about people having this argument, you might be forgiven for wondering how people could have a debate on whether or not you can choose things. How could they choose to have such a debate? Because that's normally how we talk about free will, right? When we say free will in normal day-to-day life, it just describes your ability to choose things. For example, consider a contract. A contract is only valid if you signed it of your free will. If I grab you by the hand and force a pen into it and move your hand manually to make you sign the contract, then your mind was not the determining factor in whether or not the signature was made, and so therefore we don't say it was signed of your own free will, or we may even say it wasn't you really who signed it. Because in the context of choices and will, you is pretty much synonymous with your mind. This makes free will a simple, causal concept. Really, the concept of free will in day-to-day parlance is just the concept of causation applied to the decision-making part of your mind. Free will is a useful concept as well, in moral reasoning especially with regards to blame. If we want you to behave well, then we will credit you if you do something good and blame you if you do something bad. This incentivizes you to do good things and disincentivizes you from doing bad things. This only works because your mind is A, affected by incentives, and B, a significant causal factor in determining what happens around you. If I were to give blame or credit to an entity which is not affected by incentives, then that would be pretty pointless. Blaming the sun for setting in the evening will not stop it from doing it again. And if we were to blame something that can respond to incentives but has no significant causal role in that thing happening, then that would also be pretty pointless. Blaming you for the sun setting in the evening will also not stop it from doing it again. Maybe it's a little unclear how being able to be affected by incentives is directly connected to free will, so let me clarify. To be able to be affected by incentives is simply to have preferences. Any entity that prefers X to Y can be incentivized to give up Y by offering it X in exchange. That is an incentive, X, causing that entity to change its behavior by giving up Y. If you're not seeing where this is going, then let me make this even clearer. Another word for preferences is will. When you say you don't have the will to get out of bed in the morning, you're not saying that your muscles are insufficiently strong to lift you. You're saying that your preference for, say, coziness seems to be outweighing your preference for being productive at this moment. So free will is pretty simple. It just describes something with preferences and the ability to affect the world in order to satisfy those preferences. I mean, it's free will. If it has no preferences, it has no will. And if it has no ability to affect the world in any way, it's not exactly free now, is it? So, to back up that last point, if I chain you to the floor, one would say that I have reduced your ability to affect the world. And most people would say that means I have reduced your freedom. Specifically, your freedom to affect it in ways that involve you getting up. So, there may be some things in the world, other than minds, that possess free will in some form, but minds are certainly the clearest example. We can test the hypothesis that minds have free will by offering them things and seeing if this is effective in altering their behavior. If they have freedom, then minds will be able to impact the world in some way, and if they have preferences, and therefore a will, then there will be some incentives which will be effective in altering their behavior. To anyone who says that incentives don't alter their behavior, we can offer them $1 trillion and threaten them with death to admit that they do. Anyway, so how could anyone possibly doubt that free will exists? If you have incentives, you will behave differently. Therefore, preference-having decision-making structures in your mind are an important factor in the causal chains that happen around you. Those structures can be impacted by incentives because you have preferences. So you have a will, and it is to some degree free. This definition of free will is perfectly applicable to all the situations in normal life where we use the phrase, so why would this be so hotly debated? Well, you see, when people enter this debate, they tend not to define free will in that simple, normal, functional way that I did. They define it as, well, it's hard to say. Let's go through a few examples of people in the free will debate, arguing one side or the other, and see if we can figure out what they mean by free will.
In the external or physical world, we're all aware of standard cause and effect, right? Object A acts upon object B with force X. We all get that because it applies to just about everything from electrons to athletes. But now consider events in your internal or mental world. What causes your thoughts? Some of our thoughts have external causes, like when we touch something and suddenly realize it's hot. We don't deliberate whether or not to pull our hand away, right? Our brain has already fired the instruction to do so, involuntarily. In some strange sense, we didn't really pull our hand away at all, because we didn't choose to do it. Our brain did it before consulting us.
Okay, so we're off to an interesting start, not just with the definition of free will, but also on the definition of you. I mean, on the one hand, the self is often a slippery concept. I mean, if you tap me on the shoulder, I could say you touched me, or I could say you touched my shoulder. So which is it? Is my shoulder part of me, or just something that I own? It kind of depends on how we're talking about it in that specific context. Now, on the other hand, we are talking about a specific context here, free will. In this context that we're talking about, it's you, the decision-making entity. So, now, PragerU could be charitably interpreted here to be saying that you are not the part of your brain that sends the signal to move your hand when you touch something that is unexpectedly hot, which arguably makes sense. I mean, if I offered you $1 trillion and threatened you with death in order to get you to not pull your hand away next time you unexpectedly touch something hot, you would probably still fail despite the incentive. Maybe you would happen to remember quickly enough so as to keep your hand there, but you probably wouldn't. So it seems arguable as that it's some kind of automatic process which your free will does not have the ability to overcome, and at least with that amount of time to act. I'm not sure, is the point. But like any framework for analyzing the real world, the concept of free will has grey area. And in this situation, we're in it. But either way, this is a charitable interpretation of PragerU's point, which is called into question by this next clip from later in the same video.
A second cause of our thoughts is internal. Say you're thinking about giving a big presentation, and as you do so, you get increasingly nervous and your blood pressure and your heart rate jump up. Now, nothing external is acting upon you. You're doing all the causing internally, right? Your anxious thoughts are causing your brain to send signals to your heart, and we get that. But now I want you to consider a third category of your thoughts. It's your conscious choices. Something as simple as choosing where to go for lunch. Now, when you introspect, when you think about your thinking, do you believe that you're the active agent in charge of the process, or that you're just a passive recipient of the instruction? That you have no choice in the matter. It's all external forces, be they environmental, genetic, chemical, biological, or neurological. In other words, do you think all your thoughts have external causes beyond your control? Or do you think that you control some, if not most, of your thoughts? Now let's stay with our lunch example for a second. Back to the question. I ask you, where do you want to go for lunch today? Now, if all you are is a brain, an exhaustively physical system of neurons and synapses, then there's no you that's going to be making a choice at all.
So, first of all, taken one way, this is extra strength retarded. If all you are is your brain, there's no you. Is he saying your brain doesn't exist? I mean, he's saying that if you are your brain, then you don't exist. If your brain exists, then the statement is false. If you are your brain and your brain exists, then you, the brain, exist. But of course, that interpretation is probably not the one he means. To complete the quote, if all you are is your brain, then there's no you that's going to be making a choice at all. So maybe that's supposed to be interpreted as, if all you are is a brain, you can't make any choices. But that would only be a valid argument if we presuppose that brains can't make any choices. Why would we presuppose that?
Your thought processes are basically just a complex series of colliding electron dominoes crashing into one another. It's just physical cause and effect, right?
And there we have it. The core of the argument. Free will, whatever that means to these people, is supposed to be something other than cause and effect. Which is weird. It's diametrically opposed to the normal colloquial definition of free will that I described earlier, the one that we use when we ask whether you signed a contract of your own free will. In that definition, the fact that your mind is subject to cause and effect is essential to our designating you as having signed that of your own free will, and therefore essential to whether we're going to hold you accountable for having signed it. I mean, if we could have no causal effect on your behavior by offering you something for fulfilling your end of the bargain and threatening you with something for failing to meet your end of it, then there would be no sense in holding you accountable for anything, let alone signing that document. It's not going to affect your behavior one way or the other because you apparently don't take in information from the external world and process that in such a way as to fulfill a set of preferences, i.e., you don't have free will by the normal definition. But, as anyone sympathetic to PragerU's point here will be thinking right now, that normal definition is not what they mean. But if we listen to a bit more of their discussion of free will, with the exception of the bold assertion that free will is by definition not cause and effect, it really sounds like the normal definition of free will. Well, let me show you.
Something that can be exhaustively understood in terms of physics and chemistry. There's no you that's an agent that's deliberating or choosing or exercising free will. And that's why, if you are just a brain, you cannot have free will. You would just be a physical machine. A very complex but programmed computer. But if you're something more than your brain, if you're the thing that has the brain, then when I ask you, where do you want to go for lunch? You're going to start deliberating. You're going to be weighing your taste preferences, the commute time, perhaps even counting calories. You'd be weighing various reasons to choose one place over another.
Key to free will, therefore, is deliberating and weighing preferences. It sounds a lot like the free will that I was talking about, doesn't it?
You wouldn't be caused to think about any of these things. You would choose to think about these things.
Except you would be caused to think about those things by your preferences, which you are weighing, and by the relevant information that you are deliberating. If you had a different set of preferences, you would choose differently. And if you received different information to deliberate, you would choose differently. That is different causes, information, and preferences, resulting in different effects, behaviors. That's why I find this pro-free will argument so strange. It seems to be talking about the same kind of free will that I am most of the time, but then there's just this bold, undefended assertion that it contradicts cause and effect. Why does free will contradict cause and effect? What possible definition of free will could you be using such that it entails the process of specific information and specific preference structures in your mind causing specific actions, and yet it contradicts the concept of cause and effect? But maybe I'm not listening to someone rational and skeptical enough. Maybe if we bring out, Sam Harris and hear what the concept of free will that he talks about is, well, then we'll get a clearer definition. Even if it's only so that Sam can say why free will does not exist.
Well, I've argued that there's no such thing as free will. So what is there? Well, there's luck, both good and bad.
Okay, so this is already interesting. Free will, by whatever definition we're using here, is an alternative to luck, right? If he's saying there is no free will but there is luck, then one thing we can say for sure about what he means by free will is that it is not luck. Strangely enough, this fits the everyday definition as well, doesn't it? If the preference having part of your mind is not a significant causal element in something that's happening, then we say it didn't happen of your own free will. And we may say that it was luck that it happened. For example, I knock you out and grab your hands and use them to fire a gun, killing someone. We don't blame you for it. We might say that by some definition you could have been said to have fired the gun, but you certainly didn't do it of your own free will. It wasn't a preference for killing that resulted in the man's death. You were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and so I used my free will to control your hands and make you shoot the guy. You were just unlucky. So, when Sam puts luck in opposition to free will, he definitely sounds like he's talking about free will by the everyday definition. But he's going to say that free will doesn't exist, which it obviously does. If I were to point that out, though, and say that he's clearly wrong, given what I've just discussed, then everyone in my comment section would probably say that I'm not talking about the same kind of free will that Sam is talking about. Some might even forget how language works long enough to make the claim that this isn't what free will really means. So let's keep listening here and see if we can begin to understand the difference between what I and people in everyday life call free will and what the people in philosophical free will debates call free will.
There's luck, both good and bad, as well as what we make of it. Actually, that's not quite true. What you make of your luck is also just more luck. Once again, you didn't pick your parents. You didn't pick the society into which you were born. There's not a cell in your body or brain that you created. Nor is there a single influence coming from the outside world that you brought into being. And yet, everything you think and do arises from this ocean of prior causes.
If a white billiard ball knocks a blue billiard ball into a pocket on the billiards table, could I aptly describe that as the white billiard ball causing the blue billiard ball to drop into the pocket? I would say yes, but according to Sam's reasoning here, the answer would be no. Because there is a prior cause, the cue. The cue hits the white ball, which hits the blue ball, which drops into the pocket. Therefore, the cue is really what caused the blue ball to drop into the pocket. But not so fast, because someone was holding that cue, and the cue would not have moved if it were not for that man. He's really what caused the blue billiard ball to drop into the pocket, but we're not done yet, of course. That man would not have been born if a condom hadn't broken. So really, the broken condom caused the blue ball to fall into the pocket. And we can continue this causal chain back infinitely, or at least as far as the Big Bang / God, if you think that causality had a beginning. So when someone says that the white billiard ball knocked into the blue billiard ball, knocking it into the pocket, so the white billiard ball knocked the blue ball into the pocket, you can say, no, the true cause of the blue billiard ball dropping into the pocket was an ocean of prior causes involving a broken condom and the Big Bang. And what a helpful comment you will have made. Now, words can mean whatever we want them to mean. You can use language however you like. But I have an alternative way of thinking about this. I would say that the white ball did cause the blue ball to drop into the pocket. I would also say that it's correct to describe the pool cue or even the Big Bang as a cause, even if a distant or partial one, in the case of one of those things, of the blue ball dropping into the pocket. I say that there are causal chains. Each cause results in an effect, which itself becomes a cause of future effects. The fact that each cause itself has a cause does not stop it from being the cause of later effects. That way, we can look at the white ball, consider how it's moving, and predict beforehand whether it will cause the blue ball to drop into the pocket. No consideration of the Big Bang required. Once we have this understanding of causes, we can then take action on the white ball to prevent it from causing the blue ball to drop into the pocket if we like putting a hand in the way. Cheating, I guess. As I say, you can choose to define causes in any way you like. However, if you define causes in the useful way that I do, then you would be apt to say that you choose your actions, no matter how many prior causes precede your choices, because you still caused them.
Now, most people resist this idea, seemingly at any intellectual cost, for reasons that I can't understand. Because this single insight is the antidote to arrogance and hatred, and a profound basis for compassion for others who are less lucky than you are.
Compassion is an emotion that causes you to withhold retribution or lend aid when you otherwise wouldn't. For example, someone might knock over your sandcastle, and you might be angry. Then he might tell you that he's sorry and that he has a leg injury that causes him to lose balance. This might cause you to feel compassion for him and reduce any blame you'd apply to him. You would do this because the purpose of blame is to disincentivize bad behaviors. which is to say bad things that occur due to the decision-making parts of our minds. However, this doesn't work if the decision-making part of our minds is not a significant causal player in the event. Therefore, we are right to reduce blame that we apply in that case. Not necessarily eliminate it. Perhaps we still think the guy should have known he had a leg injury and been more careful, or perhaps we assume that he's responsible for his leg injury in the first place. But the bad event that you thought it was, where someone intentionally ran through your sandcastle, would certainly be more subject to influence by the social incentive of blame than if he just had a bad leg, and so we would apply more and angrier blame in the former situation. However, with Sam's analysis, none of this makes sense. According to his version of free will, nothing is your fault. So it never makes any sense to apply any blame to anyone. So if he's defining free will in the way that I do, referring to the results of the decision-making parts of your mind, then when he says that the non-existence of free will would be the basis for compassion, he's kind of more right than he probably means to be. Never blaming anyone for anything would be rather extreme compassion. The only problem is that free will, by the common definition, quite clearly does exist. There are decision-making entities called people which have preferences and are a significant part of the causal chain that results in what we call their actions. Now, I know that he'd say that he doesn't really mean this kind of free will, that he means this mystical type of free will that for some reason violates causality and yet also isn't luck. But by this definition, why on earth would we be more compassionate if this non-causal free will isn't real? Right? Blame, and by extension compassion, are only useful because our minds are causal. You would be caused to behave differently by blame or the threat of blame, so we apply blame to you and withhold compassion. So Sam is arguing against free will as this undefinable violator of causality, and would presumably reject my simple functional definition. But then when he draws lessons from this reasoning he's gone through, he seems to be reverting back to the normal everyday definition. Seems like doublethink to me. And this is supposed to be the rational skeptical view here. But as maddening as the free will is magic and it's fake people are, and as baffling as the free will is magic and it's real people are, the worst, in my opinion, are the free will is quantum mechanics magic and it's real people. I present Michio Kaku.
Newtonian determinism says that the universe is a gigantic clock that's wound up at the beginning of time, and it's been ticking ever since according to Newton's laws of motion. So, what you're going to eat 10 years from now, on January 1st, has already been fixed. It's already known using Newton's laws of motion.
Known by whom? I don't know what you're going to eat 10 years from now. I'm vaguely familiar with Newton's laws of motion, and I've heard of the Big Bang, and yet I am unable to figure out from that what you're going to eat 10 years from now. I seriously doubt that anyone knows what you're going to eat 10 years from now, nor do I think that the best way of figuring it out would be to consider the conditions at the start of the universe and extrapolate from there. Yes, I know, he doesn't mean that Newtonian mechanics literally implies that someone does know, only that someone could, in theory, use the information at the beginning of the universe and knowledge of the way that particles interact in order to predict what you're going to eat for lunch. But in theory is doing a heck of a lot of work there. Even given the boundary conditions of the universe, it would not be humanly possible to get an even approximate idea of what one organism named Michio Kaku is going to eat for lunch billions of years later, based on Newtonian mechanics. You could get a much better idea about what he's going to eat for lunch 10 years from now by considering him as an agent with preferences and the ability to act to achieve them. If we know what Michio prefers, say, for example, that he really likes burgers, we might have some indication that he'll eat a burger. If we know even more about his preferences and we know exactly what options are available to him, we could hypothetically get to the point where we can predict what he'll do with 100% accuracy. Not by considering the trajectory of atoms, but by considering you, Michio, as an agent with a will, i.e. a desire to fulfill a set of preferences, and more specifically a will that is free, i.e. the agent is not restricted from taking actions to fulfill those preferences. Now, I can already hear the complaints that I'm still just missing the point. It's not so much that someone could, in principle, figure out what you're going to have for lunch 10 years from now. At least it's not that fact itself. It's more about what is implied by that fact. Specifically, I suspect many would say, the implication that what you're going to do is therefore already determined or fixed, as Michio says. It's the idea that's been consistently brought up, or at least implied, throughout all three of the videos that we've watched so far. The idea that we're only free if we could have done something other than what we did. But could from what perspective? If you don't think that matters, consider a deck of cards. I draw the top card, and I look at it, and I don't show it to you. What are the chances that it's the Jack of Hearts? Well, it depends on the perspective. For you, you would rightly say that the chances are 1 in 52. For me, it's either 1 in 1 or 0 in 1, depending on what card I see in front of me. Because that's all could really means, right? It means given some limited information set, I cannot tell whether this is the case or not. So I will say it could be. So to relate this back to the point, could Michio choose to have burgers or sushi in 10 years? Yes. From my limited information set, I can't rule out either. So, from my perspective, he could. But what about from the ultimate perspective? What ultimate perspective? God's? God would presumably know, so God couldn't honestly say that Michio could choose anything other than what he ends up choosing in some sense. But whether it's me or whether it's God, this is all irrelevant to whether Michio in fact did choose, of his own free will, what he was going to eat. I would just say that I didn't know what Michio was going to choose, and God would say that he did know what Michio was going to choose. But the very fact that knowing what Michio's preferences are would indicate what he's going to eat is evidence that it is in fact he who is choosing. His preferences are determining what he eats. That's what it means to choose something. Oh, wait, I forgot. That's not what he means by choice or free will. But then why does he take implications from this reasoning that really seem like they apply to that definition? Observe.
Does that mean that a murderer, a horrible mass murderer, isn't really guilty of his works because it was already preordained billions of years ago?
No. The murderer is responsible for his works. If he did not have a preference to murder, then he would not have done so. Therefore, his preference having decision-making mind, caused the murder. We should blame and punish people when they are responsible for murders because this will cause people to murder less, because people prefer not to be blamed and punished. The whole concept of responsibility is dependent on the mind being causal. Please tell me you're starting to see what I mean. These people would say that they're defining free will in some mystical way that requires a violation of causality, then conclude free will doesn't exist, and then go on to draw conclusions that seem dependent on free will being causal.
Heisenberg then comes along and proposes the Heisenberg uncertainty principle and says, nonsense. There's uncertainty. You don't know where the electron is. It could be here, or many places simultaneously. This, of course, Einstein hated because he said God doesn't play dice with the universe. Well, hey, get used to it. Einstein was wrong. God does play dice. Every time we look at an electron, it moves. There's uncertainty with regards to the position of the electron. So what does that mean for free will? It means in some sense we do have some kind of free will. No one can determine your future events given your past history. There's always the wild card. There's always the possibility of uncertainty in whatever we do.
Okay, so let's grant that quantum mechanics really does imply that things are, in some sense, fundamentally random. That there really is no causal mechanism resulting in the behavior of these subatomic particles. It's just some kind of magic randomness going on there. And let's grant that these quantum fluctuations have a significant effect on the processes of the mind, such that they'll change our behaviors. How the hell does that make you more free? I mean, by the apparent definition that PragerU and Sam Harris used. The kind of free will that violates causality. By that definition, sure, it certainly would mean that you have free will. But That should be seen as an argumentum ad absurdum that shows why anything non-causal isn't what we would recognize as free will. Let me put it this way. Imagine that quantum activity is in fact non-causal, but that it isn't significant enough to access your mind or change your behaviors in any way. Like the reactions are too small or something along those lines. You'd presumably say that that means that, damn, quantum mechanics exists, but it doesn't affect us, so we don't have free will. Right? Well, then let's say that we put a chip in your brain that responds to this quantum randomness in a way that makes you jerk your arm. And just do it randomly. Those random jerks of your arm would finally be free, wouldn't they? Look, my arm is randomly grabbing my face. This is not based on some icky process of genes and previous experiences resulting in preferences which result in actions. This is totally independent of any rational mechanism in my mind. Therefore, it's the one part of me that is free. Hooray for my insane alien hand syndrome, for it has set me free. I think this misunderstanding of free will as somehow non-causal, both by those who say that it does and does not exist, is deep down based on a refusal to believe that you are not magic. You see, you begin to understand how your mind works, let's say, and that's basically that it's a computer made of meat. You then maybe even see demonstrations of those experiments where they attach electrodes to someone's head and use them to predict with near 100% certainty that when someone's going to reach for a button. You realize that this whole process is causal, understandable mechanism, and you experience some kind of cognitive dissonance because if this meat computer is a mere causal process and not some kind of indescribable form of magic, then it isn't really you. Because you're something else. You take the fact that your choices can be explained as evidence that they're not your choices. But that only follows if you are not a causal process. If you're willing to admit that you yourself are a causal process, none of that should surprise you. Not the electrodes experiments, not the hypothetical about the Big Bang and predicting what you're going to eat for lunch. Yes, it's possible to predict what you're going to do. You're rational. You do things for reasons. You have purposes. Therefore, if someone understands your reasons, your purposes, they can predict what you'll do. Quite right. If it didn't work like that, you'd be being irrational, right? I mean, if I understand what you want and what you would need to do in order to get what you want, and then I don't see you doing that, then you're making a mistake, aren't you? You're doing something that will fail to get you what you want. So the fact that you are a rational, causal process should not be something to run from. Conversely, from what many seem to intuit, the very fact that your actions could, in principle, be predicted by considering the nature of your mind, that's exactly how we know that your mind is responsible for your actions. But I'm sure that still, after all that, there'll be many people who say that I'm not talking about real free will. And if that's you, then please, one, tell me exactly what you mean by free will. And when you're done with that, given that your idea of free will isn't the thing that makes someone responsible for their actions, because as I explained, it's the definition of free will that I use that does that, and given that your idea of free will isn't the thing that justifies credit or blame, because again, that requires that free will is causal as I defined it, then please, tell me why the hell I should care.